Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be answering a listener question about whether his plan to turn back to the airport after a takeoff engine failure and land on a different runway seems reasonable. And to help us discuss when to attempt the impossible turn, aviation journalist Rob Mark will be joining us. And so that you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app you're listening to us now, take a moment right now and touch the subscribe or follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 259, we had great fun talking with singing pilot Ken Dravis about his inspiration for the Go-Around song and about his professional piloting career. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/259. And this is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. So if you enjoy this episode and you get some entertainment value from Aviation News Talk, please take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to sign up to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. To do that, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. This week in the news, an airliner crossed an active runway at JFK, and we'll play the ATC audio for you. Used aircraft prices are leveling off, and we'll tell you about an airport that is suing a neighbor for jogging. All this and more, and the news starts now. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, FAA investigating after Delta Jet forced to make emergency stop on JFK runway when American Airlines Boeing 777 passes in front. The FAA has confirmed that it's opened an urgent investigation after an American Airlines Boeing 777 crossed an active runway in front of the departing Delta Airlines 737 while the jet was speeding along the runway for takeoff. The near miss occurred at New York's JFK on Friday evening when the American Airlines flight American 106 was preparing to depart for London Heathrow. At the same time, Delta Airlines flight 1943 bound for Santo Domingo had already been cleared for takeoff. Data provided by Flight Radar 24 shows the American Airlines jet apparently crossing runway 4 left at the same time the Delta jet was beginning its takeoff roll. After a few moments of acceleration, the Delta jet suddenly comes to a complete halt while the American Airlines moves from the active runway. In a statement, the FAA says it is investigating the incident after a preliminary analysis showed that the Delta jet managed to stop with just 1,000 feet between it and the American Airlines Boeing 777. Now, elsewhere, I've read that the departing jet had reached 99 knots on the runway before its rejected takeoff. Now, that's a high-speed rejected takeoff, so maintenance checks were required, and the flight crew then timed out, and so the flight was canceled that evening. Here's what that all sounded like.
American 106 Heavy, cross runway 31 left at Kilo.
Cross runway 106 Heavy.
Delta 1943, wind 35018, gust 24, runway 4 left, clear for takeoff.
Alright, clear for takeoff, runway 4 left, Delta 1943.
Delta 1943, cancel takeoff clearance. Delta 1943, cancel takeoff clearance.
Rejecting. Alright, then, the Delta 1943.
Yeah, Delta 1943, are you able to taxi or need a couple minutes to run checks?
Yeah, we can get up the runway, Delta 1943.
Delta 1943, turn left, Juliet, and just remain clear of runway 4 left.
Left on Juliet, and remain clear runway 4 left for Delta 1943.
American 106 Heavy.
106 Heavy, go ahead.
American 106 Heavy, possible pilot deviation. I have a number for you. Advise ready to copy.
Ready to copy. Go ahead, sir.
American 106 Heavy, stand by. American 106 Heavy.
The last clearance we were given, we were cleared to cross. Is that correct?
American 106 Heavy, we're departing runway 4 left. I guess we'll listen to the tapes, but you were supposed to depart runway 4 left. You're currently holding short of 31 left.
Roger, American 106 Heavy.
American 106 Heavy, I have a number for you. Let me know when you're ready to copy.
Ready, copy, sir.
American 106 Heavy, read back correct.
And my thanks to liveatc.net for that audio, which I've condensed to save time. Now, the FAA has long stated that they expect that the next major air accident to be on the ground, which is part of why they're investing in systems that can monitor traffic on the ground, such as their ASDX system that's now installed at 35 airports, including JFK. And it's possible that that system gave controllers the first alert of the conflict. It should be remembered that the deadliest plane crash in history occurred on the ground in 1977 when two Boeing 747s collided on the runway at Tenerife in the Canary Islands. That crash was caused by a series of miscommunications and resulted in the death of 583 people. And you may remember that just a few weeks ago, I was on board when a pilot failed to stop when we were told to hold short at an intersection, and that was a close call as a few seconds later, a Bonanza went through that intersection in front of us at about 60 knots, and that could have easily been a fatal accident. So please be vigilant when you're taxiing. From avweb.com, soaring prices for used aircraft appear to be leveling off. Aircraft valuation specialist Sandhills Global noted that inventories for used aircraft in all classes, including piston singles, have increased and asking prices decreased in December 2022, dipping from historic highs the month before. Accordingly, Controller.com department manager Brant Washburn warned potentially greedy sellers, quote, asking values for used aircraft still remain elevated, but as used inventory levels continue to trend upwards from the historic lows of early 2022, sellers need to carefully monitor aircraft value trends in the near future. Regarding U.S. and Canadian used piston singles, the Market Analyst Equipment Value Index reveals year-over-year inventory levels that rose 78.2% in December. The number of used piston singles in the market dipped 4.5% from November to December, but have trended up since the end of Q1 2022. Quote, asking values decreased 0.66% month over month, reported Sandhill, but the long-term gains through 2022 place asking values up 11.7% year over year in December. And from avweb.com, a somewhat related story, BizJet COVID boom easing as newbies drift away. The frenetic pace of the business jet market is starting to ease as COVID wanes and threats of a global recession loom. In an essay on the current trends provided to AvWeb, market analyst Brian Foley says the COVID-spawned increase in BizJet sales and usage was bound to end, but a hopeful stat within that surge may not have the long-term benefit that some had hoped. Many of those who bought up just about every fractional share, along with new and used aircraft, were new to private aviation, and the hope was that they wouldn't be able to give it up. That doesn't appear to be the case, according to Foley. Foley said the numbers are down across the board in the industry, with noticeable decreases in new and used sales and fractional flights. He said it appears that largely the result of many of the newcomers returning to their pre-COVID travel habits, and it will likely take another major upset like the pandemic to bring them back. Quote, my estimate is that less than 10% of those new to GA will remain in the fold, which still favorably raises the baseline obtainable market for the industry from this point forward. Foley said the calming of the market is merely returning the industry to healthy historical norms and giving the stressed-out players a bit of a welcome break. This is frankly a relief for an industry that was never scaled to be a mass transit system and has been overwhelmed over the last couple years, he wrote. Also from avweb.com, FAA deletes foreign information from sectional charts. Pilots in border regions of the U.S. are wondering why the FAA has deleted much of the aeronautical information from non-U.S. airspace from its latest sectional charts. The late December release of the sectionals omit detailed airspace information in Canadian airspace, and the changes reportedly apply to Caribbean and Mexican regions along the border and off the coast as well. The change was announced October 12th in a single-paragraph charting notice that said that foreign areas included on sectionals would be, quote, skeletonized. Until the December release, the FAA had included the same level of aeronautical information on neighboring airspace. Now the charts in non-U.S. airspace contain only major airports, navaids, and airways. In some cases, Canadian airspace, particularly in southern Ontario and the Atlantic provinces, get as much or more U.S. traffic as domestic use, as American operators overfly Canada to get to U.S. destinations. Canadian pilot groups have also flagged the changes and are querying their officials about it. From flyingmag.com, GA Airport turned into emergency base in storm-ravaged California. One of the arguments used to protect airports from closure and redevelopment is that they are public resources, especially in times of emergency. That's exactly what is happening at Ocean Ridge Airport, E55, on the coast of California. PG&E, the company that provides the bulk of California's power, is using the airport as an emergency staging area as wave after wave of atmospheric rivers come in from the Pacific, knocking out power. The airport is located in the southern tip of Mendocino County, approximately 100 miles north of San Francisco. The area is rural and popular with artists and tourists. The airport is managed by Julie Bauer. She says almost overnight the airport, which has 25 hangars and 11 based aircraft, turned into a small city with some 300 residents, all working for PG&E. These teams are scrambling to restore power to thousands of people left in the cold and dark by the storms that are battering the Golden State with heavy rain and high winds resulting in flooding, downed trees and power lines, landslides, and massive blackouts. According to Bauer, on January 7th, she received a call from PG&E asking if they could use the privately owned airport property as a staging area for the emergency crews. I said, of course, Bauer said. The airport is a resource in our community. I met with an official from PG&E and we drove around the site in the pouring rain to see if it would meet their needs. The pop-up city at the airport includes bunker-style housing, potable water tanks, tanks for gray water, showers, latrines, and caterers to feed 300. Bauer notified the tenants of the situation and issued a notum advising the aviation community that the airport was going to be closed for the duration of the emergency. The housing was placed on the approach end of runway 31, effectively closing the airport to airplane traffic, although there was still designated space for helicopters should a medical emergency arise or supplies need to be airlifted in or out. Some of the airport buildings have also been pressed into use, she noted. For example, they needed a food tent that won't blow away because there's still quite a bit of wind, so they ended up taking the pilot's lounge for the caterers. The airport is being supported by generator power. The rest of the homes and businesses have sporadic power, said Bauer, as the lines are blown down, taken down by trees, or turned off so that the utility company can make repairs. As for how long the camp will be in place, that depends on the weather and the damage done. Bauer told Flying that the utility company told her the airport will remain closed until the end of February, but that is a soft date. From KEYT.com, Santa Barbara Airport begins phased reopening after storm. In the wake of heavy rains, the Santa Barbara Airport was closed last week, but started a phased reopening on Tuesday afternoon, one day after flooding closed the air traffic control tower and grounded all flights. According to a tweet, the airport had notified all airlines and was working to restore service to and from the Santa Barbara Airport. The airport said parking areas could be limited in private and GA areas. The airport first grounded all flights and closed its control tower on Monday because of storm-related flooding. From planeandpilotmag.com, a bad weather report leads to a fatal crash on a snowy flight. Now, this one's pretty unusual. It's axiomatic that as pilots, we don't trust weather forecast. A pilot and his wife recently died in a crash, partially caused by unexpected bad weather, but they weren't led astray by a lousy forecast. It was the official weather observations that were seriously wrong. The 72-year-old had been a private pilot for 10 years, logging a total of 1,600 hours, more than 1,000 of them in his 2005 SR20. The plan was to fly the aircraft from Craig Moffett Airport, KCAG in Colorado, to Joslyn Field Magic Valley Regional Airport, KTFW, in Twin Falls, Idaho. The distance is 336 nautical miles, and it was the first leg of a trip they've made quarterly for several years. The aircraft departed at 2:30 p.m. for the VFR flight. Contacting Denver Center for flight following, the pilot stated they were VFR direct to the destination, quote, although it looks like I'm going to have to go quite a ways south of the direct because of convection. The aircraft headed approximately west at 17,500 feet. As a VFR-only pilot, he couldn't go any higher as flights higher than 18,000 are reserved for IFR. At 3:13 p.m., the pilot told the Salt Lake City controller he was still heading west to avoid some convection and that hopefully they would turn back north in 50 miles. At 3:51, ATC suggested that to avoid IFR weather, he could navigate directly to the Ely VOR and then north on course. The pilot reported they were going visual. I hadn't planned to go as far west as Ely, he said, but if that's what I have to do, I can. 90 minutes into the flight, the prospect of safe VFR flight to Twin Falls seemed to dim. Mountains below, IFR altitudes above, layers of cloud, areas of snow, some blocks of restricted airspace, and the clouds were closing in. He said, quote, we might have to go underneath the deck here in about 50 miles. Right now we're in the clear, but it's just too high a buildup off to the west to clear it, the pilot told ATC. As he slowly descended to 10,500 feet to maintain VFR, controllers started to lose the aircraft on their scopes. They suggested Ely's Yellen Field, K-E-L-Y, as a divert option with a 230-degree heading and 75 miles. Salt Lake Center reported precipitation showing on its radar to the north, saying the weather observation at Ely is showing a ceiling of 5,000 and overcast broken at 6,500 as well. It seemed like a reasonable proposal, and the pilot replied, "Roger, thank you, we are heading to Ely, going to put down there." What neither the controller nor the pilot knew was that the AWOS weather station was broken, though the National Weather Service knew it wasn't working properly. Local pilots had been complaining for weeks. The visibility value was sometimes missing, sometimes seemingly correct, and sometimes reporting 9 miles when the actual visibility was much less. The airport manager had reported the issues to the National Weather Service. An Ely FBO manager told the NTSB of a landing jet pilot weeks earlier being very upset with the ASOS reporting 9 miles when the actual visibility was 1.25 miles at best. That pilot reported the issue to Flight Service and to Salt Lake Center. Descending out of radar contact, ATC terminated radar services and told the pilot to squawk VFR. We know what happened next from data saved by the airplane's onboard avionics. Starting at around 9,000 feet, less than 3,000 above the airport, the pilot circled around several times looking for the runway. He made a descending circle to the right and then turned left and right. If the weather had been as reported, he should have been able to see the field, but the weather was not as reported. A witness just east of the airport reported hearing an airplane flying low, noting the weather was very bad with clouds at treetop level. A second later, a pilot since 1977 was monitoring the Unicom frequency at home and heard clicks of someone activating the pilot-controlled lighting. He estimates the visibility was about 1/4 mile in snow. Then a voice transmission. "Are the runway lights on? I can see the runway." About a minute later he heard, "I'd like to land, but I cannot see the runway," and there were no further transmissions. After the accident, the NTSB determined the probable cause to be the pilot's decision to continue the VFR flight into IMC conditions and icing conditions. The pilot was not instrument rated, and the aircraft was not certified for flight in icing conditions. The other thing that didn't happen is the pilot didn't deploy the Cirrus CAPS parachute, which was found still in its launch tube intact in the aircraft. The NTSB reported no anomalies were noted with that system. And also from planeandpilotmag.com, young pilot force lands small plane on snow-covered hillside. Losing engine power in a small single-engine airplane immediately exposes the flight to additional risk, but in some circumstances that added risk is a lot greater than at other times. The latter applies to the forced landing of a Piper PA-28 Archer in northern Italy recently, a landing that defied the odds in a big way. The pilot, a 22-year-old woman named Sylvia DeBon, deserves huge praise. The small plane was on a sightseeing flight over the Dolomites, a scenic mountain chain in the north of the country, when the plane's engine quit. It's not clear how high the plane was when this happened, but it was essentially amidst the peaks, which rise to 11,000 feet. DeBon spotted an area that looked like a possibly survivable place to put down, a steep, snow-covered slope. So DeBon, who says the plane's power loss gave her no choice but to put it down somewhere, aimed for that spot. Now, we're used to landing on a flat surface, but DeBon, who had surely never landed on a steep upslope before, somehow knew she had to raise the nose very high at touchdown, and she did. The plane landed in deep snow, and all three people were able to walk away with minor injuries. And the really lucky part? There was a hiker's cabin just a couple hundred yards up the slope. The rescue came soon, and DeBon has become a bit of a celebrity in Italy for her quick thinking. And from AOPA.org, AOPA fires back at Santa Clara County amid 100 low-lead fuel ban. Now, this is a long article, but let me pick out a couple areas that struck me. It starts out, AOP and other stakeholders cited several inaccuracies in Santa Clara County's motion to dismiss or resolve in the county's favor a Part 16 complaint submitted in October that warns of unsafe practices at the Reed-Hillview Airport. In the initial complaint, AOPA and co-complainants asserted that the county is violating grant assurances, risking safety, and imposing undue hardships on aircraft owners, operators, and business owners at the Reed-Hillview and San Martin airports with a ban of the sale of 100 low-lead. AOPA included an affidavit from Reed-Hillview Airport business owner Nick Ravesh, who confirmed that misfueling occurred at Reed-Hillview and indicated that the lack of 100 low-lead availability contributed to an aircraft accident. According to Nick Ravesh, the accident aircraft, a Piper PA-32, came to him for an extensive annual and had about 15 gallons of fuel in each tank. Historically, this aircraft would arrive in need of refueling before its annual, and the pilot would fuel the aircraft at Reed Hillview before departing. Nick Ravesh and his team worked on the aircraft for approximately 4 months. When the plane was complete, Nick Ravesh said he personally observed the aircraft had little to no fuel remaining in the left tank as a result of the engine run-ups. He said, quote, "It's my understanding that the operator of the aircraft was aware of the aircraft's fuel status, but was not able to obtain 100 low-lead fuel at the airport, and that the pilot planned to fly to neighboring San Jose International Airport to obtain 100 low-lead. As a result, the aircraft departed Reed Hillview with little to no fuel remaining. After the crash, Nick Ravesh says he was told by an NTSB accident investigator that the aircraft had run out of fuel. And I've looked at photos of that crash, and it appears that the aircraft just made it to the airport boundary. It appears to be leaning against a fence on the airport property." And the other part of the story talks about self-fueling permits. The county claims to offer owners and operators the option to apply for a self-fueling or emergency self-fueling permit, which would allow pilots to potentially use fuel obtained from the source of their preference with no assistance from the county. AOPA cited an affidavit from San Martin Airport tenant and aircraft owner Paul Marshall that stated he applied for a self-fueling permit for 100 UL, and after 3 months of no response and no viable 100 UL options available, abandoned his application. Marshall said, "I have never requested a self-fueling permit from the county for 100 low-lead, as I understand that they would refuse such a request. County staff has communicated to me quite clearly that 100 low-lead fuel will not be permitted on the airport." And it winds up by saying AOPA will continue to work with the FAA and public use airports until a safe and viable transition to an unleaded fuel option is available. And finally, from the expressnews.com, the story comes from San Antonio, Texas. Bourne Stage Airfield owners take neighbors to court for jogging near runway safe zone. The owners of Bourne Stage Airfield have taken homeowner Joshua Brandt to court in Bexar County for allegedly jogging on the edge of the runway safe zone in violation of the airport safety procedures and creating a dangerous condition for all approaching and departing air traffic. He has been trespassing and causing a nuisance, the owners say. Brandt, who has lived in the community for about a decade, says the airfield's owners have engaged in unwarranted and aggressive actions in an attempt to restrain him from using the airport property and his easement. This week, a state district judge issued a temporary injunction preventing Brandt from running within 125 feet of either side of the center of the runway. The judge said, quote, "The court's ruling is merely a safety issue at this point with respect to the airstrip. Brandt can continue to use the airport to fly his Piper Saratoga. The two sides are set to go to trial in October." Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk with Rob Mark about knowing when to attempt the impossible turn. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now for a few updates. Let's start with the good news department. First, congratulations to Jonah Gibbons. He says, "Love your podcast. In particular, I found great tips and info in the conversations with Jason Blair. I passed my private in November in Tallahassee, Florida." So congratulations, Jonah. And from Justin Chalk in Illinois, he says, "As an aside, I recently passed my IFR check ride, being one of the best orals my DPE had from the past several years. I'm very happy to say I found your podcast just a few weeks before I took that check ride, which was immensely helpful in my mental approach. I hope to donate soon as a thank you for helping me get in the right headspace." Well, congratulations, Justin. And mega supporter Brian Pullman wrote, "I completed my instrument check ride yesterday. I found it to be a challenging rating, but I had a great instructor and lots of support along the way. Thank you for all the great content. So much of it was relevant to my training. Thank you also for having Seth Lake on the show. After learning about him on your show, I subscribed to his YouTube channel. His series on the instrument ACS was very helpful. So congratulations to all of you. And if you've recently passed a check ride and have good news to share, let me know. I'll share that with others. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. And here's an article I ran across from AOPA.org. It was written by Joseph LaRusso, who's an aviation attorney. He says, "I'd like to share a recent case study. This case is one that is repeated all over the country and involves a young student airman. Prior to beginning his training, he completed his MedExpress medical application." That's the online form you need to fill out before you go see a FAA doctor to get a physical. And says he was granted a third-class medical certificate. After he started his training, he read an AOPA article that discussed the potential pitfalls of the MedExpress form. More specifically, the article discussed how an expunged conviction is still reportable to the FAA. The airman immediately knew he made a mistake on his first ever MedExpress form. Years earlier, this airman was arrested and charged with a substance-related offense. Rather than being convicted of the charge, the airman successfully completed a diversion program. After finishing the program, the airman's criminal attorney had the record expunged and sealed. He was then told by his criminal attorney that he never needed to report the event ever again. While that advice might be correct in the civilian world, it's improper in the aviation one. In certain situations, the MedExpress form requires an airman to detail an arrest resulting in attendance at an educational or rehabilitation program, regardless of the legal outcome. In consideration of the article, the airman made the decision to ground himself and suspend his training while he attempted to set the record straight. Unfortunately, FAA counsel decided to issue a revocation of the airman's medical certificate, and as if to add some solace, the attorney made it known that the airman could apply for a new medical the following day. Little, if any, care was given to the fact that a student pilot would be forced to continue his career with a scarlet A on his record from his very first medical application. Anyway, it's a long, detailed article. I've included a link in the show notes in case you want to read the full article. And here's an article from boldmethod.com that mentions something that I was not familiar with related to the ILS critical area. It says, when should you hold short? When do you need to hold short of the yellow ILS critical area markings on a taxiway? It says hold positions for ILS critical areas consist of 2 yellow solid lines, spaced 2 feet apart, connected by a pair of solid lines spaced 10 feet apart, extending across the width of a taxiway. While the markings look similar to runway hold short markings, they signify completely different requirements. And I often tell people that these markings look a little bit like railroad tracks, though the ties are not evenly spaced. The article continues, air traffic control protects the ILS critical areas when arriving aircraft are inside the outer marker final approach fix on an ILS approach. And this is the part I didn't know. And the reported ceiling is less than 800 feet or visibility is less than 2 miles. So if the weather is poorer than that and there's somebody on the ILS inside the outer marker, you will be told to stop and hold outside the ILS critical hold markings. The article continues, when instructed by ATC to hold short of the ILS critical area, pilots must stop so that no part of the aircraft extends beyond the holding position marking. Once the landing aircraft is on the ground, you'll get clearance to cross the ILS critical area and continue your taxi to the runway. While all of this works well for towered airports, what about non-towered airports? If you're at a non-towered airport and there's an aircraft on the approach inside the final approach fix and the ceiling is less than 800 feet or visibility is less than 2 miles, you should follow the same guidelines. Hold short of the ILS critical area until the landing aircraft is on the ground, then continue your taxi to the runway. Finally, you should follow the same exact rules at towered airports when the tower isn't in operation. And of course, I'll include a link to this article in the show notes if you want to read more. And here's something I spotted when I was at my flying club today. It's a notice for an upcoming Flying Companion seminar put on by the Santa Clara Valley 99. So for this particular one, you or your companion would need to be able to get to San Jose, California this weekend. And the description they have on the website says, are you a frequent passenger in small planes? Do you have family or friends who are pilots? Are you curious to learn more about aviation? Then you are a companion, and we hope to see you at our workshop. Taught by experienced female pilots who love to share our passion for flying with others, this workshop will teach you what goes into a basic flight, what all those dials and buttons do, what keeps an airplane in the air, who are the people on the radio and how to talk to them, how to help in the cockpit, what to do in an emergency, how to navigate through the sky. And it runs from 8:30 in the morning till 4 p.m. at Tradewinds Aviation at the Reed Hillview Airport. And it's going to be held this coming Saturday, January 21st. So if you or your spouse or partner is interested, go to SantaClaraValley99s.org to sign up. Cost is $99, which includes breakfast and lunch and training materials. And if you're not able to get to this seminar, check with a 99s chapter near you to see if they plan to put on a similar seminar in your area. Now, my wife attended one of these many years ago, and I was just amazed at how much she learned, so I can highly recommend the seminar. And here's a suggestion that I made to another CFI a week or so ago over the radio, and this might improve your ability to report your position if you're flying IFR as well. I was working with a client doing landings at the Tracy, California airport, and while we were in the pattern, a Cessna 172 was doing a practice approach to the RNAV GPS runway 12. Now, we were on the downwind at the time, and he announced that he was on short final while flying this instrument approach to runway 12. Well, we were on downwind. I glanced at the traffic map, which showed him to be a good 4 to 5 miles from the airport. We went ahead and extended to follow him, but I thought his position reporting of short final was extremely misleading. Now, the aircraft did a touch and go and later announced that he was once again on short final while flying a different approach to runway 26, and this time the aircraft appeared to be about 3 miles from the airport. After making his low approach and his final call before departing the airport, I said, hey, just an idea, next time you might say we're 2 miles or we're 3 miles from the airport rather than just saying you're on short final, as this will give us a better idea of where you're located. And the CFI said, thank you, and that was that. So just wanted to pass that along. And here's a message that came in from Mega supporter Arjun Guraj. He was replying to a message I had sent him, and he says, also, I was thinking it would be really cool if Garmin came up with an alarm that you can set at a certain distance from the waypoint that you've programmed. This could be a nice chime that would let me know that we're coming up to that waypoint for those kinds of situations where we need to leave that waypoint at a certain altitude or heading. Just a thought, take care. And I mentioned that if you check page 103 of my book for arrival alerts, there are alerts that you can set for arriving at the airport. It doesn't give an audio alert, but it does give you a message on the PFD, which is almost as good. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Sean Brown. He says, thanks, Max. I learned something new from every episode. I'm a rusty, low-time private pilot, just getting back into flying, having purchased a 1979 Cessna 182. It's my intention to start working on my instrument rating as soon as I get back into the swing of VFR flying. Do you have any tips on things I should be practicing or reading on my own before I start my IFR training? Thanks again for the great show, Sean. And I wrote back and I told him I tell people there are 3 ways to learn the material you need to know for the instrument rating: taking an in-person ground school, studying videos like the ones you can buy from Sporties, or reading books such as the ones that come from the FAA. Either way, it's probably about 30 hours of studying regardless of how you do it. You can do any one of the 3 or a combination, as they all reinforce each other. So I'd probably sign up for the Sporties course or download the free instrument flying handbooks that are available at FAA.gov. Also, you can find them in the documents section of ForeFlight. Now, if you do that, the instrument flying will make much more sense if you read ahead before you actually start flying. And if you don't, it'll be a little confusing initially, and you'll need to spend more time and money getting a CFI to teach you what you could have learned on your own. Have fun working on the new rating. And as I mentioned, I'm planning to work on a new rating this year, and I've already started reading and watching YouTube videos, and I think it really helps so that when you go for your first lesson that you know a little bit about what's going on. And you probably heard the national news story that the FAA had a ground stop where they stopped all airline traffic because of a problem with the computers that deliver NOTAMs. And I saw a survey that went up on avweb.com, the poll, do you bother with NOTAMs? You can probably guess how these divided out. The categories were honestly, never, rarely, usually, always, and other. And the first category, honestly, never, 12%, rarely, 18%, usually 27%, always 40%, and then other 4%. So kind of an interesting survey. And here's a message from a patron supporter, Nicholas Reel. He says, good day, Max. Thanks so much for the care and enthusiasm you put into this great show. I'm a student pilot flying out of Hayward and approaching my private check ride. Aviation News Talk is a wonderful source of flying knowledge, news, and entertainment, which I've come to rely on during my long commutes to the airport to keep the blue side up. Thanks so much, Nicholas. And we've had a small handful of people who've joined in the last couple weeks to support the show. See if you know any of these people. They include Mike Mathis at the $8 a month level, Tony Hernandez, who decreased his pledge to $9. We have 3 people who've joined at the $20 a month level. They include Dirk Froboes, Stephen, and Steve Schneider. Thanks so much for your donations. We also had a one-time donation from Charles Sieferman for $25. And Charles wrote, I've listened to your excellent show for a bit now and wanted to get some support to you so that the great content can continue. Charles, thanks so much, and thanks to everyone who donates to the show. And if you'll just take a couple of minutes right now, you can do the same thing. I'm sure you've probably thought in the past, I'd like to donate to the show when I get around to it. Now would be a great time to just go ahead and do it. Head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up via Patreon. Specify the dollar level per month you'd like to donate, or you can make a one-time donation by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And let me also thank the many of you that have purchased Lightspeed headsets, but who have used the link that we have in our show notes. When you do that, you'll pay the same price as if you went to their website directly, but by using the link in our show notes, they will end up paying us a small referral fee, and they all add up. So thanks so much. If you're interested in checking out the Lightspeed headsets, they've got 3 different models, and you'll find links to them in our show notes. Coming up next, our conversation with Rob Mark about knowing when to attempt the impossible turn, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And before we get to Rob, let me just mention, if you're interested in this topic about turnbacks to the field after an engine failure, take a listen all the way to the very end of the show, because I'm going to include some information about new guidance that the FAA is providing instructors about teaching the turnback to the airport after an engine failure. And I'll also have a link to Captain Brian Schiff's seminar, which he gave for the National Association of Flight Instructors, NAFI, on the impossible turn. And now let me tell you a little about Rob Mark. He's the former senior editor of Flying Magazine, and he's also worked as an air traffic controller, an airline pilot, corporate pilot, and CFI. Rob publishes the Jetwine blog at jetwine.com, and you can find his writing in numerous publications, including AOPA Pilot and in the pages of Business and Commercial Aviation magazine, part of the Aviation Week group. And now here's our conversation with Rob Mark. Well, Rob, welcome to the show. Great to have you back as always.
Hey, thank you so much for re-inviting me, Max.
We are always happy to have you here. Hey, we recently heard from Justin in Illinois, who lives pretty close to you, I would imagine. He was listening to episode 192, in which you and I talked about avoiding takeoff emergencies. And we presented a long list of tips, so people may want to go back to listen to that at aviationnewstalk.com/192. But here's what he wrote in part. He said, regarding turning back to the runway, I'm hoping to get clarification. It seems unilaterally the wisdom is that the impossible turn should be discounted as a viable means of dealing with loss of thrust on takeoff. Every discussion then explains the reaction time, the greater than 180-degree turn, and landing on the same runway. All excellent points. But what never seems to be discussed is whether or not it would be safer to use such a procedure if it's under different circumstances, and more importantly, briefed as an option. My home airport is KPWK, that's the Chicago Executive Airport, which has a preferred departure on runway 16 and also has 2 intersecting runways, runways 624 and 1230. Because of its proximity to O'Hare, all departing IFR aircraft are instructed turn 040 within 1/2 mile of the departure end, and all VFR traffic are instructed to turn left or right according to intended departure direction. I fly Columbia 400, and within that 1/2 mile of the departure end, I'm typically well above 400 feet and in a turn rather quickly. My typical departure briefing includes a landing straight ahead, but after 400 feet, as I will already be in a turn, I include the option to return to the airport that becomes active at 500 feet for landing on a crossing runway. For what it's worth, as a matter of course, I distinctly included in my brief, quote, "This is a standard departure from my home airport," home in all caps, "and the expected performance of today's takeoff allows a return to runway 30 or 24 if a loss of thrust is experienced after initiating my departure turn." He says this is actually printed out in my custom departure checklist and is not used for departures from any other airfield. He says, I understand that it can be a tricky situation to add specific anomalies to a training environment, but I'd love to hear your opinions on when it's acceptable to deviate from avoid the possible turn advice when the circumstances make it more possible or even preferable. So first he says it seems unilaterally the wisdom is that impossible turns should be discounted as a viable means of dealing with loss of thrust on takeoff. In other words, don't do the impossible turn ever. Do you agree with that or disagree?
Well, why do you think it picked up the moniker impossible turn? It is impossible for most pilots, I would say, most small aircraft pilots, because one, they don't have any experience flying the airplane at 300 feet in the air at 80 knots or 70 knots, and they just probably have heard about this. And I think that unless you have been out there practicing this and it happens in the airplane you've been practicing, you're fooling yourself to think that if you're under 500 feet, that you're going to be able to safely make a steep turn and land back on the runway you started from.
Well, tell us first a little bit about Chicago Executive, since that's your home airport as well. And then we'll come back and talk about some of these circumstances when you might or might not want to do an impossible turn.
I will mention that the preferred runway 16 departure is, again, to the south towards O'Hare. And one thing to keep in mind is that the only reason air traffic does that is that they like 16 because our instrument arrivals come from the north, and it's easier for them to sequence aircraft behind arriving aircraft. But that is the old name. Chicago Executive in the old days was known as Palwaukee. But Palwaukee has a couple of other runways. They have 1230. If you were going to take off to the northwest, it's not quite as problematic. There's also 624, which the airport is in the process of getting rid of. They want to shut it down so they can construct more hangars on the empty space. And again, 1634 is used primarily because, again, it's easier for the tower controllers to do it. Now, I have to admit, I have a little bit of extra history here because I was a controller at Palwaukee back in the can I just say back in the last century, Max?
Sure.
Okay, back in the last century. And if we had stuck with one runway as they do today, we would have been given a reprimand probably in our file for not being flexible enough to use all the options. Again, we could do a whole story about the, air traffic control system these days. But again, departing runway 16 from Palwaukee, as I'm visualizing it, I've had this thought many times, actually, when I've sat in the right seat or even in the left seat of an airplane. Where am I going to go if the engine quits? And I always confirm it about 100 feet in the air that there's really no place good to go. It's all residential and some light manufacturing to the sort of the southeast through the southwest corridor, which is why people like to get turning quickly. To the east of the airport is the forest preserve, and the trees are rather tall. They're large. So again, is that a great option? Trees tend not to bend very much, no matter what they're hit by. Going to the west, more light manufacturing, more residential areas. So I think where I would start with giving Justin some advice is, have you actually looked around, maybe had somebody else fly the airplane and do a couple of 360s at 2,000 feet over the top of the airport, just so you can see what the options are. There's an interstate about, what would it be? It's probably 2.5 miles to the east of the airport, but you have to be pretty high to glide to that. And again, that's the thing I think that always frightens me about this when I listen to people talk about it, is that, as we said earlier, if you haven't practiced it and you don't know what your 182 is going to glide like with the flaps up and no power, you have no idea how you're going to perform in an emergency like that. And then when you add a steep turn, and what does everybody do when they get into a steep turn or they enter a steep turn? They start bringing the wheel back because it looks pretty scary when the nose goes down, and they usually end up stalling and spinning. It still kills an awful lot of people.
Yeah, I think what your initial comment about why do they call it the impossible turn, probably because unless pilots have practiced it in the particular airplane that they're going to be doing it, possibly at the airport where they plan to do it, under a variety of conditions, different wind, different loading, different bank angles, and you've done it not down low, but up high, and you've done it with a flight instructor, most people don't go to the trouble to do all of those things I've just mentioned. So yeah, the odds of doing it successfully without any of that kind of training and forethought, definitely not great. And so in general, I can see why the FAA would say, don't do it, because so many people have gotten into trouble doing it. Now, I think you had a great suggestion when you talked about looking around, perhaps even having someone else fly the airplane. I have oftentimes told folks on takeoff from Palo Alto, here, let me take the controls and take a look there to the left. That's where I would go from this altitude, and look to the right. That's where I would go at this altitude, and actually point out to them the different places that I would consider landing. And I start that usually by just going to Google Maps. In fact, I brought up Palwaukee Airport on Google Maps while you were talking here, just so I could see, if you're taking off straight out 1-6, not many good options. If you turn east, you've got the forest and some fields, probably better option than going down into somebody's neighborhood. So I would start by encouraging everybody to whip out Google Maps for their home airport and just start inspecting every possible little place where you might be able to put the aircraft down. For example, if you're lucky enough to have an airport with lots of fields in front of you, and I think, for example, in my area, the Livermore Airport, if you depart on runway 25, you got a golf course and all kinds of fields, even some roads. Boy, that's just a dream case where, of course, you're going to land straight ahead. On the other hand, if you're taking off on 7 left or 7 right, you're immediately out over houses and residential areas, and then you may want to think about other options. For example, there are some points there where I know that at a certain altitude I could hang a 90-degree turn and end up on a road down below me, taking off on runway 7 left or right, and that might turn out to be a viable option. So to me, the most important thing is to just scope out your home airport first, because that's the one where you're going to be doing the vast majority of your takeoffs. And then if you're taking off from some other airport that you're less familiar with, talk to some of the locals, or go ahead and take a look at the map before you take off from there.
Oh, I think talking to locals is absolutely a great option. Think about it from the point of flying in the mountains. I mean, there are too many smart pilots that would take off in a Flatlander airplane, let's say a 182, and head to Aspen or Telluride or Eagle, never having been into the mountains before. Why? Because there are so many things that happen in the mountains that are different from what occurs when you're flying in flatlands. So take advantage of it. You may not have the opportunity to fly with an instructor in, say, in the Rockies, but you could certainly call a local flight school and say, hey, can I talk to your chief pilot? And just tell them who you are, what you want to do, and get some advice from them. And you'll often hear the absolute gospel from some grizzly old flight instructor that's been there for 10 or 20 years that says, oh man, you don't ever want to do that, but you could certainly go over here and do, and they'll give you some advice that you probably would never have thought of. And going back to the practicing at some version of the home field after you've scoped it out, I take that to mean that when you're departing from an airport that you don't normally fly from, let's say I'm in that same 182 and I'm departing from Chicago Midway. And if you haven't looked at Chicago Midway, you might pull it up on a chart, the airport diagram, to see that it's 1 square mile and it is surrounded entirely by residential and, again, light manufacturing. And if you lose it on takeoff in a single engine airplane, you better be ready to put it down on some street somewhere. And if you're not, then you probably shouldn't be flying there.
And in terms of situations where I think a return to the airport would be less likely, I look at my airport, it's short, 2,500 feet. I'm quite confident that most aircraft would not make it back to the runway here unless they happen to be very slow, like a Citabria, which is going to climb reasonably well, not go very far forward. But in many cases, I think when people are successful doing this, They're departing from a really long runway, and they're coming back to the departure end of the runway. And so if you've got a short runway, that really decreases the odds that if you get back that there's runway in front of you, especially if the wind is such that it's not helping you get back toward the airport. Now, you had an accident that you had read about that involved parallel runways. Talk about that for a moment.
I think the airport in question was another place. I used to work at Opelika Airport down in North Miami. And just to the north of us was an airport that was called, I think it was called North Perry at the time. I think it's Hollywood. Ugh, I'm sorry for those of you in that area. I can't remember the name of your airport today. But the point is, it had a 3-6 left, a 3-6 right, a 9 left, and a 9 right. And again, it was boxed in by the roads. So I believe all of the runways were pretty much the same or approximately the same length. But imagine taking off on 9 right, which in that airport would be headed toward the Atlantic. And you're a few hundred feet in the air and the engine quits. Now, again, we've spoken about how to keep the airplane under control. Hey, and Max, when the engine quits, what's the first thing they're supposed to do?
Push.
Push. You got it, baby. Because if you don't push the nose down, you're going to run out of airspeed so quickly, you won't even know what hit you. But if you were going to make that turn back toward the airport, I read an accident report where the pilot lost it on, let's just say, on 9 right, and he tried to get back to runway 9 right because that's where he took off from. And I thought, why didn't you try to land on the parallel, which going the other way would have been 2-7 right? It just reduces your maneuvering to try to get down to in one piece on the runway. Why the pilot didn't, I don't know. Maybe he didn't have a whole lot of experience. Most people would be scared. I mean, there's nothing wrong with realizing that it would scare the bejesus out of you if the engine quit when you're 300 feet in the air. It would frighten most of us. It really would. The only issue you've got to keep in mind is that you've got to let your training take over and the need to keep the airplane under control. That's got to be primary. You can get all shook up once you're back on the ground in one piece.
Well, two things. Turning back to runway 27 left, that is theoretically a 180-degree turn, depending upon what your turn radius is and how far the parallel runways are separated from each other. And yet I think what people totally miss all the time when they think about this 180-degree turn back to the runway is it's, in most cases, if you're going back the same runway, it's not 180 degrees. It's more like 270 degrees followed by a 90-degree turn in the opposite direction. Because that first 180 degrees takes you a number of tenths of a mile away from the runway. So now you're headed in the right direction, but you're not lined up with the runway. So another 90-degree turn gets you back onto the center line, and then the 90 degrees in the opposite direction gets you lined up with the runway. And basically what that means is you're going to be in the air, or you're going to have to be in the air twice as long to make a total of 360 degrees of turn as you are for 180 degrees of turn, which is why coming back to the parallel runway, to me, is much more likely to succeed because you just don't have to turn as much.
Well, and to Justin's point, again, for those of you that are not familiar with the runway layout at Chicago Executive, he mentions a 1-6 departure, but we also have that runway 1230. And if you were to take off on runway 16 and you lost the engine at, say, 400 feet, if you were practiced, maybe you might be able to make a left turn of, 180 degrees. Wouldn't even be that far, actually. I'm sorry. Maybe 100 degrees, and you could be on a base leg for runway 30. It might work, but again, it depends. And let's face it, Max, every one of these recommendations is not they said I could do it, so I'm going to try it. No. There are so many factors that you must consider if the engine quits. We mentioned low altitude. If you were taking off into a strong headwind, and your ground speed is very slow. But when you start that turn, you're downwind, and now all of that wind is going to be pushing you even further away from the place you think you want to put the airplane down on. Have you practiced it that way? Because if you haven't, you're fooling yourself.
Yeah, you could end up landing with a really strong tailwind potentially. You use the word primed, and I think being primed and ready on takeoff to do something when the engine loses power or quits altogether is really essential. I think that typically we can expect that if people really didn't expect the engine to fail, there's probably going to be 5-6 seconds of denial and kind of cursing, trying to get through the denial real quickly to the point where you realize, oh, I've got to do something about it. But if you're primed and ready on every takeoff and you're thinking, boy, what am I going to do at 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet? I think you could cut that time down dramatically because you're primed and ready to do something. And so I try to, when I take off, and usually I'm in the right seat, someone else is doing the takeoff, I try to on every takeoff, and I don't always do this because I get distracted sometimes. I try to be thinking at every step on the way, at least in the Cirrus up until we are above parachute altitude, where at this point am I going to push forward and land this aircraft?
And that's a great point. Honestly, I flew for years, and no one ever mentioned this to me about, well, if the engine quits, you better put it down somewhere. But nobody ever, any instructor really, going through my instrument, my commercial, maybe even into my instructor ratings, said, okay, let's sit down for a minute and think about this at your airport, in this case, Palwaukee. Where are you going to go in this 150 or this 172 or the Cherokee if the engine actually quits here? And the instructor points to a place and says, you're 200 feet in the air. What are you going to do? And that's really when, because I had somebody that did that to me once. And honestly, I just started to think that, yeah, I guess I never really thought about it. I mean, I heard that the engine could fail on takeoff, but luckily I haven't had that happen except in training. But I haven't really sat down, and I'll say the same thing again because it's worth repeating, and sat down with a good instructor, someone else who has actually tried this, not just any instructor, because at the rate we're turning out instructors these days, could be somebody that's just as scared about an engine failure on takeoff as you are. It's just that they have more credentials in their pocket. And I don't mean that, I don't intend that to sound demeaning, but I'm just saying you have to really trust the person you're working with. And again, go practice it at 3,000 feet out in the practice area and say, our runway is at the 2,000 foot point, and we're going to pull the engine back at 2,500 feet, and let's see you maintain control of the airplane and turn 180 degrees and then make that 90-degree back and see if you can do it within 500 feet. Because if you can't do it in a training scenario with 500 feet underneath you, you'll never do it if you're at 300 feet. There's no way in the world. Well, then what's the option going to be? I guess you better think about something else. And again, this is, an issue that we talk about in training all the time, but so many pilots think, well, yeah, but I maintain my airplane. I know what's the old story? It ain't going to happen to me. But there are an awful lot of people that do lose it on takeoff, and they're not here to talk about it.
Well, a couple of things. You talked a few minutes ago about the grizzled old flight instructor, and probably the reason some of us get to be old and grizzled is we've been really careful along the way, and we've kind of thought through some of these things in advance. So I think anyone who kind of figures, oh, well, I'm just going to land straight ahead and hasn't given it any more thought, hey, you might want to take it that next step and just kind of figure out, well, where exactly, straight ahead am I going to land? And I agree. I think that pilots never think that bad things are going to happen to them because, we're confident, right? I mean, you want a pilot who's confident in their abilities and their skills. And I think we don't like thinking about how bad things that happen to other people could happen to us, which is why you really want to be training and thinking and practicing all these things. Now, you had mentioned going out and trying this at 3,000 feet. I want to mention that one of our listeners, who is an airline captain, Brian Schiff, has put together a presentation in which he talks about what he calls the possible turn, because apparently his dad, Barry Schiff, who's a retired airline captain and a longtime columnist at AOP magazine, had 2 failures in 172s and made it back to the runway and was criticized by a lot of people for doing that. But what Brian advocates, and by the way, I should say, you never want to try this by taking off from the surface. I think it's nuts for people to say, well, we're going to take off from this runway and at 500 feet, we're going to pull the power and turn back to the runway. I will be happy to testify afterwards that is malpractice. I think that is just the absolute worst thing for pilots to do. You want to practice this if you're going to up at a safe altitude. So fly over the airport 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet above the airport, start to climb 400 or 500 feet, and then pull the power. And Brian advocates that you first pull the power, wait 5 seconds, and then make a 360-degree turn, see how much altitude you're going to lose in a 360-degree turn. And then, since there are so many other variables, he says add a 50% buffer to that altitude. And then for that particular airplane, that would be the minimum altitude that he would, in his case, would consider turning back. And he does mention that he has a Citabria, which climbs pretty well and it works in his airplane. I think it's important to know that for slower aircraft, they're going to have smaller turn radiuses, making all this much more possible. For aircraft with faster speeds, they're going to have much larger turn radiuses, which is going to make it a lot more difficult to pull this off.
Well, and 2, as we mentioned earlier, we touched on the weather. If you practice this with your instructor in the wintertime, let's say here in the Midwest, when the air is nice and crisp and it's maybe bright at 0 centigrade or maybe -5, and the airplane's it's just screaming out there. And it actually occurs to you, taking off from the same airport on a 92-degree day in the summer, when your density altitude is probably, I don't know, could be twice the field elevation of the airport, and your engine, if it were new, which is probably not, is hardly putting out 100% power. This is all going to change. But I want to touch on one point that I meant to mention before. What is it about this turn thing that is so damned important to people? I mean, this all started maybe 10 years ago with people saying, well, it's the impossible turn, and we practiced it. And why do you care? I mean, sure, everybody would like to get the airplane down on a smooth, hard surface, but there are an awful lot of people who have tried this that, are not with us anymore because they were not successful. But if the airplane is insured, what's the big deal? I mean, I would take a road in a heartbeat, even if it had telephone poles on one side or another. I would take that in a heartbeat rather than trying to make a 180 and then a 90 or whatever at 400 feet in the air. I just don't understand that. And I think that some media journalists, I don't think I've ever advocated this, but I'm sure some of my friends in the aviation media have, about, you need to go out and try it and see what you can do and learn your limits and practice. And I just think that for most people who might practice this once or maybe twice with an instructor, and then they have an engine failure a year and a half later and say, oh, I'm okay, I know I can make it back. And they haven't considered any of the variables, the wind, the temperature, their familiarity with the airport. I mean, I'd still take my chances landing straight ahead, 30 degrees one side or another of the runway heading.
Yeah, I agree. I think the key thing is that you probably only want to consider doing this is if you have no good options straight ahead. If you've got that road straight ahead, yeah, I think there's probably a much greater possibility of making that work out than making a turn back to the airport worked out. I think that we as pilots are just so primed to make sure that we don't ding the aircraft because, we might get charged, or it might, we have to pay the deductible out of the insurance or whatever. So on a daily basis, as we're landing, we're incredibly careful. We're taxiing, we're careful. We don't want to ding up the airplane. But I think the mindset has to totally change when the engine quits, because at that point, your primary goal should not be to prevent dinging the aircraft. Your primary goal at that point should be saving your life. And you might even want to be creatively destroying the airplane as you land straight ahead to enhance the probability that you're going to survive. So, for example, if I had a really small football field ahead of me, I might consider hitting one of the wings on one of the uprights of the goalpost, because I know that that's going to spin me around, as opposed to, running into the wall immediately in front of me. Or I might go between two trees, which hopefully would pull the wings off and slow me down before I get to the cliff or the wall or whatever it is after that. So yeah, we got to figure out how to decelerate over the longest possible piece of ground. And if we don't have much ground, well, you got to be creative about finding ways to slow that airplane up, even if it means destroying the airplane.
And you just reminded me of an example of training example I did with somebody in an SR20 years ago, when he was the first student I'd ever trained in an SR20, because this was a long time ago, Max, but people said, "Are you crazy? You're gonna teach somebody to fly in an SR20, a class airplane? That's going to be so complicated. He'll never learn to fly." Well, he actually did, and he was a pretty damn good pilot. But we were out practicing in the north of Executive Airport, out in the fields. There are so many flat fields that we have to practice on. I pulled the engine on him by, pulling the throttle back. And I said, "Okay, well, where are you going to go now?" And he looked around and he said, he's looking left, he's looking right. And he said, "Oh, off to the right." He said, "We're going in that field over there." I said, "Okay, let's see if you can make it." And he got, he had the airplane all trimmed up for best glide speed and all that kind of thing. And he was religiously dropping flaps gingerly as he was on the base leg. And I said at one point, "Are we going to make it?" He said, "Oh, yeah, we're going to make it." I said, "Okay, let's see." And as he turned final, I said, "Are we going to make it?" He said, "I think we're going to overshoot it." And, there was a fence at the end, a small fence, but I mean, it wouldn't have been the end of the world. But I said, "Watch this." And I said, "Let me have the airplane a second." And I had my hand on the throttle in case we needed to go. But I just took the stick and I pushed it in. I pushed it down a little bit. So we increased our airspeed, because he had all the flaps out. And I said, "Hold it down. We're going to hold it down for 5 seconds." And of course, we came down at kind of a hellacious rate for about 5 seconds. And when we were still maybe 300 feet off the ground, I relaxed and I put the pitch of the aircraft, the nose pitch, back to the glide speed, and we would have made it into the runway. And of course, I put the power to it and went around. He went, "You can't push the nose over like that." I said, "Well, you know what? It's a funny thing. People have always taught me the same thing, because you don't want a high rate of descent when you're close to the runway or to the landing field. However, if it's a case of, if I overshoot this runway, we're all going to die, I'm going to push the nose down for 3 or 4 seconds to get the airplane lower and make the field." And you know what? If you live to tell about it, that's all that matters, because I don't care if you tear the airplane up, rip the wheels off. Who cares? All I care about is that you come back in one piece. Now, am I saying that every time you're a little high, you should shove the nose over and make it down to the runway? No, of course not. But again, there are just so many variables when the engine quits that you need to consider, that you can't close your mind to anything, but realize it's happening at a time when your mind is going to be so busy. You're going to be so overwhelmed, possibly, that you have to use whatever resources you can. And, again, that I didn't plan on doing it the way that I did it in the Cirrus that day. It just came to me. And I knew the engine was running, and we flew out of it just fine. Again, I would never have done that around an airport where there were people that could have gotten hurt, but it proved a point. For that day, in those conditions, we would have gotten down in that field.
Yeah, I think it highlights how all of us should be thinking these things through ahead of time. Because if you haven't really fully thought through all of the what ifs, all the different circumstances, all the different scenarios, you're not going to be able to think of them on the fly when you're under stress in the airplane and that propeller quits. So you need to spend a lot of time thinking about all these things ahead of time. Now, you mentioned the SR20. I spend most of my flying time is actually in the SR20 teaching student pilots, also teaching instrument pilots. Great airplane. There was an accident in Southern California, a fatal accident. This was in around maybe 2005. I believe it was at the Lancaster Airport, Fox Field, in which an instructor and the client decided to practice the impossible turn. And I will start off by saying that this was not a Cirrus CSIP instructor, so this was not someone who'd been factory trained. What they did is not included anywhere in the Cirrus training material. It's not sanctioned by Cirrus. I don't recommend it. They thought they would try the impossible turn. They took off at some altitude, 500 feet. The instructor pulled the engine, and they crashed and burned and were killed on their impossible turn back to the airport. So when I say trying this, at the surface is malpractice as an instructor, I strongly believe that. It was totally unnecessary. They didn't follow any of the protocols that Cirrus has. They didn't even follow any good practice, which we've just discussed, which is if you're going to practice this, practice it from a couple of thousand feet above the airport. So anyway, I want people to take away that this is very serious. This is not something where you just kind of go, oh, well, Max and Rob said it might work under some circumstances, so I'll give it a try. Boy, there are so many circumstances under which this will not work that you, given the choice of, not practicing it much and considering not doing it at all, just don't do it. Land straight ahead. There are just too many ways that can bite you unless you spend a lot of time and are very thoughtful and analytical and go through this in a methodical way.
And I think worth mentioning was a story that we talked about, for me at least, I think in 192, in episode 192, where I was flying with a fellow in a SR20, and he hit the flight director button before takeoff, and it pitches it, I think you said, to 6 degrees?
7 degrees, I believe.
7 degrees. Okay. So we took off on Milwaukee's runway, which is about 5,000 feet, and we reached, I don't know, 200 feet in the air, maybe, and we were screaming 135, 140 knots. And I said, let's go up. And he said, geez, what are you so excited about? I'm following the flight director. I said, and I said, let me have the airplane for a second. And I just pitched up to get us away from the ground. And we talked about it later on the ground. And I said, think about what we were doing. If we'd had an engine failure, yes, you would have been screaming at 135 knots, which is what's best glide speed with the flaps up in a 22, about 85 maybe or something?
It depends on the model. The older ones were around 88 to 89. Newer ones are higher than that.
Okay, well, and I said, think about this for a minute. You lose an engine at that airspeed. Nice. Airspeed's always helpful because you can yank back on the stick and balloon up and grab some altitude if you're prepared for that. But if you're not, you could end up being 200 feet off the ground and fussing with the pitch of the airplane and bleeding off airspeed bit by bit by bit and still not know what you're going to do, because it's frightening flying an airplane at high speed within a couple hundred feet of the ground. So he said, but they taught me to do it that way. I said, I'm sure they did. But I bet you the person that taught you may also have flown turbine airplanes, because we're taught to do that in the jets. You hit the takeoff go around button before you or as you line up, and then when you push the throttles in on both motors and you pitch up. We have the V1 speed people may have heard of, which is the decision speed. There's VR, which is rotate, and I should say the decision speed is based on, is everything running correctly? Because if there's anything, any kind of light, anything that looks unusual, you haul them both back and you stop. And if you've planned the takeoff correctly, you've got enough runway to stop the airplane without going off the end. Rotate speed means pitch up to the climb attitude, and you're flying. Even if the engine quits, or if one of them quits, you can still fly the airplane on one engine and safely return. There's a V2 speed, which is our safety speed, and that's what we normally climb at until we're away from the ground. In the Hawker, I just looked it up before we started doing this because I don't remember. It's been a few years since I flew that airplane, but we're looking for somewhere in the neighborhood of about 130, 140 knots as we climb to get into our safe climb speed, which is about 160 in that airplane. But again, you're making the transition from getting away from the ground to, okay, I think we're in pretty good shape. We can reduce the nose pitch a little bit and let the airplane accelerate. But a good way to keep that in mind is if you ever fly on an airliner, watch them take off. They climb. The airplane leaves the runway. They bring the gear up, and then there's another momentary pitch change where the captain, or the pilot flying, pitches the nose up again a little more, because the point is they're going to be a little slower, but get away from the ground. That's the point of it. The change in pitch when they start accelerating at 600, 800, 1,000 feet, whatever, is so subtle, most people in the back would never even feel it. But again, everybody in the front knows we have to get away from the ground as quickly as possible to give ourselves an edge if an engine quits. But in a single engine airplane, you don't have another one. So you've got to be thinking way ahead of that airplane in case the engine does quit. And what are you going to do? First of all, you've got to pitch down, because if you don't, you're going to bleed the airspeed off and the airplane's going to stall.
Yeah, and certainly with your example that you talked about taking off in the Cirrus, where they were not climbing anywhere close to VY, when I'm flying, I'm always trying to get up to the minimum altitude for using the parachute in the Cirrus as quickly as possible, because I would certainly hate to think that I couldn't use the parachute because, hey, we were just taking our sweet time climbing up. It's like, well, wait a minute. We've got a safety tool there that we can't use if we don't get up to that altitude as efficiently as possible. Now, I've heard from two people who have done recurrent training in the Pilatus, and both of them told me that in the simulator, they've been given scenarios where, and I don't know the altitude, but say, 1,000 feet, they're up in the clouds, the power has been pulled, the engine has been failed, and then they do a maneuver to return back to the airport. And apparently the trainers have figured out that in a Pilatus, under some circumstances, you can do this. I don't know exactly the maneuvers that they're suggesting. One thing I did is I went online just to find out what is the glide ratio in a Pilatus. It's about 15-1. So that's considerably better than most of our single engine aircraft, which are anywhere from 7, 8, 9-1, something like that. And so that certainly would help make that more possible. Also, the Pilatus has a very slow stall speed compared to business jets and twins and things like that, which would also help to make that possible. But a couple of other things I was thinking about in terms of when would you consider turning back to the airport? For example, I think we've kind of talked about the general category where if there's a certain death ahead of you, well, of course, you're going to turn back away from that. You might as well take your chance and a turn rather than proceed on into the building in front of you, the cliff in front of you, whatever it might be that you perceive as being a certain death. But I think there's another situation as well, which is if there's a high probability that you think you're going to end up killing innocent people on the ground. And I think a great example would be The schoolyards, I mentioned that taking off from Reed Hillview, there are 3 schoolyards off to the right as I'm departing from the airport. Well, you can darn well bet before I ever landed in any of those schoolyards, I'd be looking to see, hey, are there kids playing there? Is there a soccer game going on? I mean, I think as pilots, I think it's really incumbent upon us to not share our misery with other people. If we've had rotten luck and things are not going well for us, fine. Don't share that with innocent people who might be on the playground below you.
That's true, and that is one of the unwritten rules of flying aircraft is that it's not all about you. It is about you, of course. It's about your passengers. It's about your airplane. But it's a dynamic world that we live in, and you can't not think about people that are near the place where you might come down. And you have absolutely no right to endanger their lives. And if you haven't thought about that, then you need to think about it right now. And it's another variable. Gee, I can do that 20-degree left turn and put it down right over. Oh, wait, after takeoff, there's a schoolyard over there. Or there's a soccer field over there. Yeah, but you know what? If I had to get down, I'd put it in the soccer field. Would you really? If you saw, as you're trying to glide down and you saw a couple hundred people on the soccer field watching a game, would you really try to put your airplane in there? Because if you do, then I don't really want to know you.
Hey, back at episode 192, you mentioned one other thing that I had forgotten, and I thought it was worth mentioning again. You had said that Mike Bush, who we all know is a columnist at AOPA, very well-known former, not former, he was the 2008 A&P of the year. He said that you are more likely on takeoff to lose one cylinder than to lose the entire engine, which actually is good news because that means you still have some partial power, which means in that circumstance, you might actually have enough power to make a somewhat normal return back to the airport, as opposed to doing one of the very complex power off returns to the airport that we've been discussing.
That's a really good point. And Mike made an excellent point that if the engine is still running, don't screw with it. Better to have some power than none at all, because it gives you another option. And that's a great training routine, is to have somebody up at altitude and practice. Gee, the engine's not performing. It should be turning about 2350 and we're down at 1700. Oh my God. And they start checking the mags and the fuel and doing all the stuff they've been taught. And I said, so what would you do now? And I've had a number of people say, well, I'd probably pull the mixture and shut it down. But again, you can't learn hard and fast rules about flying because there are just too many possibilities that can happen that you must work with, that you have to say, well, wait a minute. Common sense would tell me that if I have some power, I'm better off than having no power. And again, there's no hard and fast rule in flying that hardly any that you can count on when you're working in a single engine airplane close to the ground, except stay away from the ground.
Yeah, and just to add with the partial power that we're talking about, if you do find yourself in that situation, don't assume that you're going to be able to continue with that amount of power forever. You still want to get to the ground as soon as possible, because invariably the rest of the engine probably is going to start quitting as well. So have that in mind if you've got some partial power.
Well, it's funny that I remember when I was getting my multi-engine rating, which I did in a Cessna 310 back in the last century, but I had come out of maybe 5 or 6 hours in a V-tail Bonanza, which I thought was unbelievable, having gotten out of a 150. But when I got in that 310, I thought I was in a 747 because it was moving so fast. I couldn't believe it. But we practiced engine failures and all the good training. And we got back on the ground, and the instructor said, well, you know what? The good thing about a twin is that if the engine quits, you've always got a spare. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, but doesn't it really depend on what it is that made the first engine quit? I mean, if it's bad fuel, I mean, it's only a matter of time before the other one's going to quit too, right? And he looked at me and went, oh yeah, that's a good point. I wasn't trying to show him up. I just thought about it logically because I was trying to understand the why we do things in airplanes and why we don't do things in airplanes. And I think if you don't understand the why and you never question anything anyone ever teaches you, you could have either a very lucky flying career or perhaps a very short one.
No question. As pilots, we have to be constantly thinking about our circumstances because, as you said earlier, there's no one thing that's going to be true 100% of the time. Hey, Rob, thanks so much for joining us here today for this thought-provoking conversation. If people want to see and read more of your work, where do they go?
Well, they can find some of my work at Business and Commercial Aviation online, which is part of the Aviation Week group. They can find me at Jetwine. They'll find some of my stuff between the pages of AOPA Pilot on the turbine side. And who knows, maybe at Milwaukee, if I'm wandering around and you say, look at that poor instructor, he looks really hard up. I wonder if I should buy that guy lunch. It's probably me, and the answer is always sure.
That's great. Rob, thanks again for joining us here today.
You betcha. Thanks, Max.
And my thanks to Rob Mark for joining us here today. You can find more of his work at jetwine.com. Now, I want to mention that there is a new advisory circular that has come out, 61-83J from the FAA, and it's ostensibly about giving flight reviews, but in it does have a section called Return to Field Engine Failure on Takeoff. That's A-11-4. And it's rather interesting. It says now that the FAA is encouraging flight instructors to give training on turnbacks to the airport. Specifically, it says flight instructors should demonstrate and teach trainees when and how to make a safe 180-degree turnback to the field after an engine failure. Instructors should also train pilots of single-engine airplanes not to make an emergency 180-degree turnback to the field after a failure unless altitude, best glide requirements, and pilot skill allow for a safe return. This emergency procedure training should occur at a safe altitude. It should only be taught as a simulated engine-out exercise. A critical part of conducting this training is for the flight instructor to be fully aware of the need for diligence, the need to perform this maneuver properly, and the need to avoid any potential for an accelerated stall in the turn. The flight instructor should demonstrate the proper use of pitch and bank control to reduce load factor and lower the stall speed during the turn. After completing this demonstration, the flight instructor should allow the trainee to practice this procedure under the flight instructor's supervision. Flight instructors should also teach the typical altitude loss for the given make and model flown during a 180-degree turn, while also teaching the pilot how to make a safe, coordinated turn with a sufficient bank. These elements should give the pilot the ability to determine quickly whether a turnback will have a successful outcome. During the before takeoff check, the expected loss of altitude in a turnback, plus a sufficient safety factor, should be briefed and related to the altitude at which this maneuver can be conducted safely. In addition, the effect of existing winds on the preferred direction and the viability of a turnback should be considered as part of the briefing. And I learned about this by watching part of Captain Brian Schiff's seminar. I'll include a link to that in the show notes that was given to the National Association of Flight Instructors on what he calls the possible turn. I'll also include a link in the show notes to the FAA's Fast Team brochure called Impossible Turn. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can